Russians are still losing 1,000 soldiers a day on the front line. So it's no surprise that Putin appears to have bought 30,000 souls off the North Koreans. I don't want to be trite here, but in effect, that seems to be what they're doing. So this very basic trench warfare, and as you quite rightly point out, later on top with technology, modern technology, drones and cyber and all the rest of it. But ultimately, it doesn't look that different from the First World War trenches, and the drones are perhaps the Fokker-Wulfs and the Sopwith pups of 1914 to 18.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today on day, I think it is 1228 of Putin's 10-day special military operation into Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking to Hamish de Bretton Gordon. Now Hamish, you're a director of Doctors Under Fire still, I think, former British Army Colonel and expert on CBRN and biosecurity. And of course, your book is called Chemical Warrior, which is brilliant. I really enjoyed reading it. Hamish, welcome back to Frontline.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Philip. It's a real pleasure to be on Frontline again.
Yeah, now straight into your area of expertise. This is something that Reuters was commenting on today, but it hasn't been picked up by any of the other UK mainstream press yet. The Dutch and German intelligence agencies have gathered evidence of Russia's widespread use of banned chemicals in Ukraine, dropping choking agent from drones to drive soldiers out of the trenches. I know you've commented on this generally beforehand, but the difference is the Dutch Defence Minister Ruben Brekelmans called for tougher sanctions on the back of Dutch intelligence finding alleged use of chloropicrine, which was used, as you know well, in the First World War and is one of the banned chemicals, but had not previously been reported. How significant is this, and why are we not hearing much more about the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine?
Well, Philip, I mean, this is really significant, and have the Dutch security services, who I think are behind collecting this evidence, really talking about thousands and thousands of uses of CS gas and also chloropicrine. I've been helping out and giving advice because this has been going on for about 18 months now, and hitherto it's just been the Ukraine government who've been putting in reports to the UN watchdog, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But at the same time, Russia also claimed that the Ukrainians were doing this, as is their way on these sort of things. But it's had a real impact because this choking agent, chloropicrine, as you say, the first chemical weapon ever used in the First World War, it is incredibly effective because, in effect, if you haven't got a respirator, a gas mask, you've got to get out of the trench that you're in. And a lot of the attacks in the last particularly the last 6 months, but very much at the moment, have been, the precursor has been these drones dropping chloropicrine and CS gas. And it's been incredibly effective. What is quite pleasing, though, from a British perspective, I understand the British government are now sending out thousands of British respirators, British gas masks, and hopefully they should be hitting the front lines in the next few weeks or months. And this is a relatively easy fix. If you have a respirator, this is just riot control agent, and it only persists for 5 minutes or so. So there should be a fix there. But ultimately, this is a war crime. It's illegal against the Chemical Weapons Convention, which the Russians have signed. But we know that when it comes to the law of armed conflict, Russia doesn't really, they might sign stuff, but they certainly don't follow it. So, yeah, I think this is a big deal. And as the Russians have opened up two fronts, additional fronts around Kharkiv and Sumy, this is very significant. So the sooner we can get more respirators to the front line, the better. And the Russians need to be called out, at the UN and at the International Criminal Court.
So in simple terms, you've mentioned some of it through your response there, but very briefly, what is chloropicrine? How you said it's the first chemical weapon to be used. What are the sort of symptoms that those that are exposed to it will have? And you said it's a very short term agent, it disperses very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what we term a choking agent, and as the name suggests, if you breathe it in, it really reacts with the fluid in your lungs and incredibly unpleasant. And actually, people can die if you've got some sort of underlying issue with your lungs. It could well kill you. It also stings if any area where there's fluid, the eyes, the nose, really a painful stinging. And that's the main thing it's there for. It was sort of, it is part of the group that we'd call riot control agents, basically. And you'll remember from being in the gas chamber, testing your respirator. This is what we use, this sort of stuff, and it is really unpleasant if you get it. But it is very non-persistent, and what we mean there, it will be around for 5 or 10 minutes. But if you can imagine you're in a trench and this stuff gets lobbed into you as you're spluttering, trying to get out the way, the Russians are then following up. And as soon as you get out of the trench, their standard operating procedure seems to be to drop a hell of a lot of artillery just after they've dropped the gas, and also quite a lot of direct fire. So that's why it's been so effective. But a classic sort of type of warfare that we're seeing in Ukraine, the Russians might gain a trench and then half an hour later they lose it again because the gas has gone. But it is having an effect. And if I suppose the real concern from everybody is if the Russians decide to expand their chemical weapons program, and we all know that I'm talking to you from Salisbury at the moment, where of course the Russians used Novichok to try and assassinate Sergei Skripal. And actually, the amount of Novichok they had there, could have killed thousands of people. And if they start to use Novichok on the front line, then that is very, very serious. So that is why it needs to be called out as soon as possible.
Are there any indications that the Russians are preparing to use other chemical weapons? And why do you think Donald Trump isn't sitting up and listening to this? And again, we're only hearing this from Dutch politicians and some German intelligence leads. Why is the rest of the EU not jumping up and down?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I think because a lot of people are saying, well, it's only riot control gas, but actually that doesn't, it's still prescribed, it's still illegal. Are there indications that the Russians are going to go further? Who knows? They are using this on an industrial scale. Even the Dutch are mentioning thousands and thousands of uses. The Ukraine government is saying over 9,000 uses, which is extraordinary. I mean, I was, in Syria looking for Assad's chemical weapons, which he used about 200 times over a period of 10 years. We're talking about 9,000 over a period of about a year. So that is why the Americans and others are not jumping up and down. I don't think they realise quite how effective and the seriousness of it. And it's not like the drones and the glide drones and the hypersonic missiles, which are really easy for people to understand. I always found when I was briefing politicians and even senior officers about the chemical issue, it's really difficult for people to understand. They don't, is it a chemical weapon? Is it a biological weapon? And that people understand bombs and bullets, but they find gas very difficult. And I think that is half the issue. Why, I really value the chance to come on front line and try and articulate why this is such a big issue.
And it's something that your politicians should sit up and listen to. Now, you mentioned that the Ukrainians have been accused of this by the Russians, as the Russians would ordinarily do. But is there any evidence that the Ukrainians have used chemical weapons themselves?
Well, certainly nothing I've seen. And I'm in close contact with a lot of the frontline units, giving them advice. And certainly there is no indication at all that they are using it. And there is nothing coming back, even from the Russian troops, that they're using it. Peskov and the other, propagandists sat in Moscow in the Kremlin are saying this, but nobody on the front line saying it from a Russian side. So, as far as I'm aware, that is not the case. It's all one way. Russia to Ukraine rather than the other way around.
Yeah, well, if there's anyone that would have picked up on, those accusations been out there, it would have been you. But I think it's important that we clarify that for those that will try and take snippets of what we say and turn it into disinformation. But what's quite clear here is that the warfare at the front line, in the east, in the trenches. This is guttural trench warfare that we're now seeing First World War weapons being used. It's back to First World War type tactics with an overlay of modern weapons like drones and everything else. Surely we keep hearing from our politicians, our senior officers, that warfare has now moved into cyber and is all pushing buttons and using technology. It can't be like that in the front line, is it?
Well, I think there might be a bit of both, but you're absolutely right. The trench warfare and the casualty rates are not dissimilar to Passchendaele and other of the great battles in the First World War. I mean, the Russians ghosted through a million casualties a few weeks ago. When you think that Britain lost 345,000 casualties in the Second World War in 6 years, it really puts it into perspective. And the MAD intelligence update, I think last week, was saying that the Russians are still losing 1,000 soldiers a day on the front line. So it's no surprise that Putin appears to have bought 30,000 souls off the North Koreans. I don't want to be trite here, but in effect, that seems to be what they're doing. So this very basic trench warfare, and as you quite rightly point out, layered on top with technology, modern technology, drones and cyber and all the rest of it. But ultimately, it doesn't look that different from the First World War trenches, and the drones are perhaps the Fokker Wolves and the Sopwith pups of 1914 to 18.
Well, let's hope John Healey and other defence ministers are listening to that as they decide how the military is going to be restructured. But looking at, therefore, the supply of weapons and everything else that's coming in, we've got recent reports of the US pausing some weapon shipments to Ukraine due to concerns about military stockpiles. Now, is that excuse book 101? But from a practical standpoint on the ground, how immediately do you think this is going to impact Ukraine's defensive operations and any potential planning that they're doing for offensive operations?
Well, I've sort of written about this today. Yeah, I think this is really big, mostly or not least from a psychological perspective. When the troops in Ukraine understand that President Trump is halting supply of weapons, and the Russians see that as well. I mean, psychologically, it really hands a big bonus to the Russians. And also in the last few days, well, last night we saw the heaviest attack on Kyiv. People are claiming the whole war, 500 drones and missiles. And part of the weaponry that Trump is holding back is Patriot missiles and other air defense missiles. So it seems that Putin, who has again actually stated today he has no interest in peace, he is cracking on to achieve his objectives. And part of his playbook, which I saw at first hand in Syria, is attacking civilian targets. And that is what he's been doing in Kyiv overnight. So if these weapons run out, and I think yesterday or certainly this morning, they're saying that 72 of these drones and missiles actually hit their targets, which a couple of weeks or months ago, Ukraine was knocking down sort of 95, 99% of them. So that is certainly a concern. And moving forward, any offensive operations, if I think 155 ammunition, artillery ammunition is part of the stuff being held back. It really affects. So I think there are just two things to sum up on this, Phil. It is the messaging. And is America really running out of ammunition? I mean, I do question that. And the second thing is, just handing a huge psychological advantage to the Russians, which is no doubt why Putin today is saying, yeah, he's cracking on. There are no speed bumps that are going to slow him down. And so what? The European armies, the European countries and ourselves, must fill that gap. Absolutely. Because, if we don't give this stuff today, we're going to be having to use it tomorrow to fight the Russians, which nobody wants.
Do you think Europe is going to be able to step up and fill the void if America decides to pull out completely?
I personally think they do, and I know a lot of people suggest otherwise. But when you look at the militaries around Europe now, and you add in Finland and Sweden, the capabilities that they have, and even the amount of F-35As and Bs in Europe now is hugely significant. And I think the European countries could put together sufficient air power to really worry Putin. And in numbers terms and everything else, yeah, absolutely. But there is a reticence behind this, and there's a view that, well, we will just defend our line for as long as it takes. But actually, as you and I know, students of the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst and Staff College, a static defence is probably the last thing you want to do. Otherwise, you get back into this sort of trench warfare. So a very long answer to your question. Yeah, I think there is the military hardware in Europe and the ammunition to be able to fill in for the Americans. It's just whether there is the will. And, our own Prime Minister, Starmer, has been talking a really good game for the last few months, but I haven't heard a peep out of him in the last couple of weeks when things are getting really serious. And the focus seems to be, we criticize the Americans for being too internal looking. But at the moment, you could think that's exactly what is keeping the Prime Minister busy, when actually we've got to focus on Ukraine and make sure that they get all they can so that Russia doesn't prevail, in order that they can get a just peace, which everybody wants.
Well, it's Ukraine, but there's a global element to this. Reading in the South China Post this morning, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has said that Beijing cannot allow Russia to be defeated in its war against Ukraine. And this was a comment he made during 4 hours of talks with Katja Kallas, who's the EU High Rep for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Do you think we're starting to see the European conflict creep out into a much wider global conflict, as we see North Korea getting involved, we see China making open statements like this, and then everything that's happening in the Middle East?
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think you've got to really. I think you've summed it up very well there. I mean, the Chinese are absolutely fundamental to world peace and security, and if they start flexing their muscles, then we are to be concerned. And with Trump focusing very much on the Middle East and the Far East, I think that's why we're all getting quite rather concerned that things could go very badly wrong in Europe. But I cannot see why the Chinese would want to get directly involved with the Russians in Europe. It's this. Dare we call it a game, but this sort of global negotiations between the great powers. There is so much rhetoric, so much disinformation and propaganda. It's difficult sometimes to unpick exactly sort of what is happening. But I suppose the reassurance is that with the Americans so focused on the Far East and China, this to me might just be part of the Beijing rhetoric to get Trump, and his advisors slightly off guard. But I think what's happened in the Middle East is actually a pretty good demonstration of what the Americans can do if they use a bit of their hard power in a limited fashion. It's just a shame that perhaps they don't want to flex that muscle in Europe as well. But one gets the feeling that they are happy or they are planning to flex it in the Far East if it is required. And I think even at this stage, despite the fact the Chinese have been ramping up their military capability massively in the last 5 to 10 years, I think they probably realise they're not a match for the US at the moment. So hopefully now is the time for Trump and his advisors to really sort that issue out rather than anything else, which goes back to the original point why we in Europe have got to sort out the Ukraine issue.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I was sort of slightly taken aback as to how direct that statement was. And my immediate thought was, has something been lost in translation? But what is clear is Russia is relying on external sources of help, and China being one of them. But if it's relying on North Korea for a lot of its ammunition, you mentioned the massive strikes, drone and missile strikes that have been against Kyiv and across Ukraine last night. I think there was 9 hours of strikes that went in with, as I said, 500 or so of these Shahad 136 drones. But if Russia's relying on getting ballistic missiles and ammunition from North Korea, it required the drone technology from Iran. Iran is now licking its wounds after what's going on. Do you think Russia's going to be able to sustain this level of high volume attacks for any period of time? And what's it saying about Russia's priorities when it comes to its defense industrial base and production for the conflict?
Well, you would have thought they couldn't keep maintaining it, because absolutely they're firing 500 of these things a day. They are getting a certain amount from North Korea. They were getting stuff from Iran, but I expect that's pretty much dried up now with what Iran's facing against the Israelis and the Americans. And in manpower terms, again, we know the population of Russia, and to sustain the casualty rate they're doing, they obviously can't do it on their own, which is why they've bought these 30,000 souls off the North Koreans. What really concerns me is what the North Koreans are getting in return. And I am assuming that it is nuclear know-how, and to have a nuclear capable country in the Far East, in North Korea, with a despot like Kim Jong-un with the red button in his hands, that is a real concern. And no doubt the South Koreans and the Japanese are getting particularly nervous about this. But I think, from what I understand, the Russian psyche is that they just need to hang on a little bit longer than everybody else. And as far as Ukraine goes, they need to hang on a little bit longer than the Europeans. And, if you're prepared to accept 1 million casualties, then, you're probably prepared to accept 2 million casualties. And we know their economy is on a war footing anyway, and they're throwing all they can into it, which is why I think it's a bit disappointing that Trump isn't turning the screw on the Russian economy a bit more by sanctions and by getting the oil price down. And also, there's a lot of chatter about using Russian frozen assets. If America, who is worried about the fact it spent 60 billion euros, $60 billion in Ukraine, looked at the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets it has, then I think it would be a real statement to use those. And I would vote on us doing exactly the same. If we're not prepared to put, jets in the air and troops on the ground to protect Ukraine, well, let's spend all the Russian money that's frozen in this country and give it to the Ukrainians in the form of ammunition and other military hardware.
But then again, a lot of that money, 200 billion of that, I think, is sitting in a Belgian bank, and a lot of that is EU money. And a couple of things that we're seeing with the EU, Viktor Orban has just taken over for the next 6 months as the EU presidency, and he is, putting it mildly, not supportive of what's going on in Ukraine, and seems to be very supportive of Vladimir Putin. How significant is that? And especially when we're seeing countries like Germany who are confirming that it's going to help fund the production of 500 long-range drones or long-range weapons in Ukraine, but using in-country production. Do you think that's the right way forward? Will that get round a lot of the difficulties that we're seeing from the EU agreeing on anything?
I think the EU is a bit of a basket case, actually, when it comes to this type of thing. To me, it's an economic union, certainly not a military union. And when you've got people like Viktor Orban chairing it now, I mean, it's just ridiculous. As you say, he's closer to Putin than he is to the European Commission in Brussels, which is bonkers. And also the fact that some of the ultra-right wing parties across Europe, again, are close to Russia. So to me, and of course we are not part of Europe at the moment, European Union rather, we're absolutely part of Europe. I think the European NATO countries which very much includes us. We are the ones who should lean into this and do the heavy lifting. And the European Union, they should focus on what they do best, but not get directly involved in the military piece. And hopefully that will then not sideline, but reduce the influence of people like Viktor Orban. But yeah, it's very confusing. We talk about messaging, and of course, your past as an intelligence officer, you'd know this far better than I do. But those sort of subliminal messages, but also those outward messages, have a huge impact. And as the soldiers know, psychology is tenors to one the physical, and that mental, all the messaging coming out at the moment is only lifting Putin, and I'm sure it is weighing down those poor Ukrainian soldiers on the front line who are being gassed at the moment.
Why as a military this is something we could debate, and it's just come into the top of my head, but why from a military perspective do we get the information domain so wrong when it comes to being able to be proactive in our use of information? During the Second World War, Operation Fortitude convinced Hitler that we were attacking into Normandy through the Pas de Calais, not through Normandy. And there were very sophisticated operations like Operation Mincemeat and others that people can look up that were around that. We were good at it then. We seem to have forgotten the art of using information as a weapon of war.
Absolutely, Philip. And the Russians call it maskirovka, and part of the deception thing and all the rest. Unfortunately, I think one of the issues is that a lot of our politicians have no real understanding of the sort of military sphere, and no understanding of this type of stuff. Back in the Cold War, many of the politicians on both sides of the house had fought in the Second World War, and they sort of understood these things. But I have no great gripe with our Prime Minister at the moment, but he's a human rights lawyer. What on earth does he know about these things? And all the other people who are making decisions are just inexperienced. And nobody is a Churchill at the moment who is actually a soldier as well as a politician and statesman. So I think maybe I'm being unkind to the current lot who are running Westminster, but it just strikes me that there is not that deep understanding of the operational art of warfare. And, perhaps, maybe some of our senior officers are not articulating it in clear enough fashion. But at the moment, as the European NATO countries are not unified, with one purpose to support Ukraine, that they're in the issue. If the UK or if France or whatever took the lead, and then they could really work out what is the operational construct they want to follow, then all these sort of things hopefully be wrapped up in it. The final bit I'd say on this, that actually when you see operations like Spider's Web deep into Russia by the Ukrainians, you see the American and Israeli operation in Iran, actually, some of these deep intelligence led strikes like those are still happening, but it seems pretty far away from the capability that maybe we would be able to do today, tomorrow. And let's hope that the clever people in Whitehall are working through this and making sure that when we deliver the strategic defence review, it gives us the capability to do these sort of things and not forget all the soft stuff, the strategic communications and the influence that you need to do as part of the whole art. It's not all about just fighting.
Oh, it all comes together. And of course, it was the British that invented the Special Operations Executive, that put the manual together that General Bodanov, the head of the HUR, used as the basis for starting a lot of his commando activity across Russia. So, it's fascinating. Are you worried about where the Ukraine war is going, and how long do you think we're still going to be talking about this?
Well, of course, I think everybody's worried. 3.5 years into it, all the casualties, all the damage that's been done to Ukraine, absolutely. And at the moment, the people who could make a difference are looking elsewhere. I'm very much pointing at Donald Trump here. He could really make a difference here, but he's not choosing to do that. And maybe he'll change his mind next week. Have a good round of golf this weekend and come back to the office and get aboard it. I'm also slightly worried that we in Europe have gone rather quiet. Lots of good stuff. The NATO summit the other day, strategic defence review, and the announcement we're all going to spend 5% of GDP on defence. Well, that's fine for a few years' time, but it's now that we need the determination to support Ukraine in order that Ukraine can get a ceasefire. But I hear Putin's voice again today saying, I have no interest in peace. I'm going to achieve the aims I set out to with my 3-day special military operation back on the 24th of February 2022, and that was a complete subjugation of Ukraine. So yeah, I am really concerned, and I hope that the world doesn't go on summer holiday in a few weeks' time and come back at the beginning of September, and we're in an even worse position than we are now.
Well, the trouble is Europe does go on holiday through August and does nothing. And we've got, your comments from Putin came out of that conversation between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, who seems slightly taken aback on it. But we've got Trump speaking to Zelensky later this afternoon. So that will give us an excuse to have another chat at some stage. Hamish, it's been fascinating chatting to you today on Times Radio Frontline.
Thanks very much for having me.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.